Late May, 1848. A man walks briskly through the dusty streets of San Francisco holding up a small glass vial. Inside it, a few flakes of gold dust catch the afternoon light. He's shouting as he walks, loud enough that people stop what they're doing and turn. Gold! Gold! From the American River. His name is Samuel Brannan. Within hours, nearly every man in San Francisco who hears him will drop what they're doing, grab whatever tools they own, and head for the hills. Within weeks, the news will spread across the entire country. Within a year, it will spread across the entire world, pulling in fortune seekers from as far away as China, Chile, and Australia. It will become one of the largest voluntary migrations of people in American history. Outside of wartime, nothing else comes close. Here's the twist almost nobody knows going in. Samuel Brannan never mined a single ounce of gold in his life. And by the time the initial rush had settled, he wasn't just wealthy. He was California's very first millionaire. But here's something else almost nobody knows about this story. And it's the part that actually makes it worth telling. This isn't just a story about who got rich. It's a story about what happened after. And by the end, you'll understand why almost none of the winners in this story stayed winners. To understand how it all began, we have to go back a few months earlier to the man who found the gold in the first place. His name was James Marshall, a carpenter overseeing the construction of a sawmill for a landowner named John Sutter. On January 24th, 1848, Marshall was inspecting the mill's tail race, the channel that carries water away after it turns the mill wheel, when something in the stream bed caught his eye. Small, flattened flakes, catching light the way nothing else in a riverbed normally does. He picked a few up, bit down on one, an old, rough test for real gold, since gold is soft enough to dent under a bite, unlike the pyrite that so often fools people. He brought them to Sutter. Sutter's reaction wasn't excitement, it was dread. He understood immediately what this discovery could mean, and he wanted no part of the chaos he suspected was coming. Sutter begged his own workers to keep the find quiet, at least until he could secure clear legal title to the land. No small task, since California had only just become U.S. territory after the Mexican-American War, and the paperwork was a mess. The secret lasted a few months. Then, one of Sutter's own workers used a small amount of the gold to make a purchase at a general store in Sacramento. The store's owner was Samuel Brannan. Brannan didn't just hear a rumor. He held actual gold dust in his hand from a customer weeks before almost anyone else in California knew anything was happening. And instead of announcing it immediately, he did something much smarter and much colder. He quietly bought up every pick, shovel, pan, and piece of mining equipment he could get his hands on at whatever price sellers were asking. Only after his stores were fully stocked did he take that now famous walk through San Francisco streets, vial in hand, shouting the news to anyone who'd listen. Within weeks, he was reselling those same picks and shovels at markups of 20 to 50 times what he'd paid. At his peak, Brannan's stores were reportedly bringing in around $5,000 a day. An almost unthinkable sum in 1848, worth well over $100,000 a day in today's money. In roughly 9 weeks, one estimate puts his earnings at the equivalent of over $1 million modern dollars. And that was just the beginning. He poured the profits into land, buying up large stretches of what would become downtown Sacramento while it was still, in the words of one historian, little more than a muddy river landing. He moved into banking soon after, then railroads, then telegraph lines. By the early 1850s, Brannan was already one of the wealthiest men in the entire territory. He had never swung a pickaxe, not once. Meanwhile, Back at the sawmill, the man who'd actually found the gold was watching his own life fall apart. Once word spread, prospectors flooded onto Sutter's land by the thousands, trampling crops, stealing livestock, and settling wherever they pleased, since no one was in any position to stop them. Within 4 years, John Sutter was financially ruined. James Marshall, the man whose eyes first spotted those flakes in the streambed, fared even worse. His own sawmill failed. Prospectors eventually forced him off his land entirely, and he spent his remaining years scraping by, at one point growing grapes for a modest living. He died in 1885, in the small town of Kelsey, California, poor and largely forgotten. The man who started the entire gold rush never profited from a single flake of the gold he discovered. So here's the pattern beginning to take shape. The man who found the gold died poor. The man who never looked for gold at all became one of the richest men in the state. But hold that thought, because Brannon's own story is about to complicate this lesson in a way that makes it far more interesting than a simple "sell shovels, not gold" moral. First, though, let's actually sit inside what the rush itself looked like on the ground, because the reality was a long way from the easy fortune most people imagined before they left home. Picture a camp along one of the rivers feeding into the Sacramento Valley. No roads, no proper shelter, just canvas tents and hastily nailed wooden shacks that regularly burned to the ground and were rebuilt within days. Men stood for hours in freezing river water, backs bent, panning through gravel for flakes that, on most days, barely amounted to anything worth the effort. Basic supplies were absurdly expensive in a territory with almost no infrastructure to move goods. A loaf of bread or a dozen eggs could cost many times what it would back east, precisely because men like Brannon understood there was no competition to keep prices in check. Disease spread easily through crowded, unsanitary camps. Violence was common, and there was little organized law to answer to. And overshadowing all of it was a darker cost rarely mentioned in the celebratory version of this story. The rush brought devastating violence, disease, and displacement to the native peoples who had lived on this land for thousands of years before a single prospector arrived. A human toll historians now recognize as one of the genuine tragedies buried underneath California's founding myth. For the miners themselves, only a small number struck it truly rich. Men like George Hurst, who found substantial veins and built a real fortune. But they were remembered precisely because they were the exception, not the rule. For the vast majority, after accounting for the brutal cost of travel, equipment, food, and inflated camp prices, many prospectors broke even at best. A significant number went home with less than they'd started with. Some never went home at all. And this is exactly where the second half of the story comes in. Because while hundreds of thousands of people were funneling into California hoping to strike gold directly, an entirely different group of people had quietly figured out something more reliable. You didn't need to find gold. You just needed to sell something to the people who were looking for it. Take a young immigrant named Levi Strauss. He arrived in San Francisco in 1853, years after the initial rush had already begun. Not to mine, but to sell dry goods to the exploding population of miners, laborers, and merchants. 2 decades later, in 1872, one of his regular customers, a tailor named Jacob Davis, wrote to him with an idea. Reinforcing the stress points on work trousers with small copper rivets so the pockets wouldn't tear apart under the daily abuse of mining work. Strauss partnered with him. The company they built together is still one of the most recognizable clothing brands on Earth, all these generations later, and its origin traces directly back to solving one small, unglamorous problem for exhausted miners who needed pants that wouldn't rip. Or take John Studebaker, a young wheelwright who spent the gold rush years not searching riverbeds, but building wheelbarrows for miners who needed to haul dirt and gravel. It was steady, unglamorous, reliable work. And the money he earned building wheelbarrows became the seed capital for what would eventually grow into an automobile manufacturing company that bore his family's name for the next century. A young grocer named Leland Stanford also came west during this era to sell supplies rather than dig for gold. And the fortune he built through merchandising and later railroads would eventually fund the university that still carries his family's name today. Around the same time, a chocolate maker named Domingo Girardelli set up shop selling confections and coffee to miners craving a small comfort in an otherwise brutal life. A business that still bears his name on the San Francisco waterfront more than a century and a half later. Henry Wells and William Fargo saw a different opportunity entirely, moving money and goods safely and reliably through a chaotic, rapidly growing territory with almost no established infrastructure. The banking and freight company they built during this period still carries both their names today. Philip Armour supplied meat and provisions to hungry mining camps and used those early profits to eventually build one of the largest meatpacking operations in American history. Even something as mundane as farming paid off. One account describes a farmer who made the equivalent of roughly $160,000 modern dollars in a single year, simply selling onions to people who had no time or land to grow their own food while chasing gold. There's actually a phrase historians use for exactly this pattern: mining the miners. Not extracting gold from the ground, extracting money from the people, extracting gold from the ground. Now, back to Samuel Brannan, because his story doesn't end where most versions of this tale stop telling it. Through the 1850s and 1860s, Brannan's wealth and influence kept growing. He served in public office. He founded a resort town in Napa Valley, built around natural hot springs, complete with its own small railroad to bring in tourists. The town still exists today, called Calistoga. By most outward appearances, he was the gold rush's ultimate success story, the man who'd outthought everyone else and never looked back. But underneath it, things were quietly unraveling. Brannan had developed a serious, worsening problem with alcohol. His personal behavior grew increasingly reckless. Heavy drinking, heavy gambling, an escalating pattern of conflict with people around him. In 1870, during a serious economic downturn in California, land values that had made up much of his paper fortune began collapsing, forcing him to convert holdings into cash at exactly the wrong moment. That same period, his marriage collapsed too. A costly divorce, made worse by California's community property laws, meant he was legally required to liquidate roughly half of everything he still owned just to settle the split. Between the failing investments, the drinking, and the divorce, the fortune that had once made him California's first millionaire quietly, steadily disappeared. He spent his final years drifting, attempting new land ventures in Mexico that also failed, reportedly reduced at one point to selling pencils door to door just to get by. He died in 1889 in a small boarding house near San Diego with so little money left that there wasn't even enough to cover his own burial. His body sat unclaimed in a receiving vault for over a year, until a nephew finally scraped together enough money to bury him properly. The man who never mined an ounce of gold, who outthought an entire stampede of prospectors, who became the richest man in California without ever risking his life in a river, died with less than the miners he'd once sold shovels to. So here's the fuller picture. And it's a much more interesting lesson than the one this story seems to be telling at first. James Marshall found the gold and died with nothing. Samuel Brannan sold shovels, avoided the obvious rush entirely, and became a millionaire before most people had even picked up a pan. And still, decades later, died with nothing too. Meanwhile, the quieter builders, Strauss, Studebaker, Stanford, Wells, and Fargo, the ones who kept solving small, unglamorous, ongoing problems rather than chasing one spectacular windfall, built things that outlasted them by well over a century. This pattern hasn't stopped happening either. It's just changed costumes. Every time a new gold rush shows up, the dot-com boom, cryptocurrency, any hyped-up trend promising fast, easy fortune, the same basic split shows up again. A huge number of people rush toward the obvious, shiny opportunity everyone's already staring at. A smaller number quietly ask what these people actually need in order to chase that opportunity and sell them that instead. But Brannan's ending adds something the simpler version of this story leaves out. Getting the smart answer right isn't the same thing as building something that lasts. Fast, clever money, chasing every new opportunity as it appears, can evaporate just as easily as the fortune it replaced. Next time you see everyone rushing toward the same shiny opportunity, it's worth asking two questions, not one. What does everyone running this direction actually need? And once you've built something from that answer, will you keep building quietly for the long run? Or will you just be running toward the next rush all over again?